demonize him and don't recognize what's being revealed through him and think of him as being separate, then we are doing the very same thing that we're accusing him of doing, which is because the psychological dynamic that underlies his pathology is shadow projection, is splitting off from one's own darkness, projecting it outside of oneself. Then, of course, being that this is a dream, this waking dream just will, like, supply all the evidence of the evil that we need to convince us it's outside of ourselves. And then think about Bush. By trying to destroy the terrorists, he's becoming possessed by the very evil that he's trying to destroy.
Yeah.
And it's an infinitely creating, feedback loop. And so, so I'm actually very quickly catapulting from contemplating Bush to saying, look, something is being shown to us about ourselves that actually can awaken us, and that's what the book is about.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That feels like he's like a symbol that we can also learn a lot from actually, looking at him. And
the thing I want to say about symbols, the symbols are the language of dreams.
Yeah.
And the word symbol means, okay, if you think about, I mentioned this in the book, that what's happening through Bush is very diabolical. And the word diabolos, it actually, etymologically, it means that which separates.
Oh, okay.
The antonym to diabolic is symbolic, which means that which brings together. So the point I'm continually circumambulating in the book is that the solution, you see, because what's happening is an illness in consciousness. It's and so at the source of what's playing out in our world is the human psyche, and that's what's actually explicating itself as our world crisis. And as long as we're trying to deal with it outside of ourselves, we're just actually putting fuel on the fire. But when we actually have the recognition that the source of what's playing out is inside of our psyche, and has to do with how we actually disassociate from our own evil and project it outside of ourselves, but by turning our awareness within and actually contemplating that process, then that's to develop what Jung calls symbolic awareness, which is to actually have the recognition that this is some form of dream. And when enough of us in this waking dream have that expansion of consciousness, we can actually, like I was saying before, connect with each other, get in phase with each other, and put our collective genius together in a way where we can actually genuinely be of benefit and change the dream we're having.
And it feels like a lot of this has to do, it always takes on a form, it feels like, of a dark thing, and that is not intended to mean that that's something bad in that sense, but it always seemed to be like, in some sense, I mean, Bush is considered to be a very, evil in some sense.
Sure, and that's the way when you because in the book I continually, you see, the whole point of view that I'm contemplating things is from the point of view of it being a dream, and the way dreaming works, because I always bring in, in one sense I'm just translating Jung's work, because he was very turned on to. He would say when an unconscious daimonic content, and I should just define daimonic, it's actually not a personal energy, but it's a transpersonal or archetypal energy that can actually possess a person or a whole nation when it's when it's at the point of actually being potentially able to be integrated. And the daimonic, if we're not in conscious relationship to it, it becomes negative and becomes demonic. But Jung defined the daimonic as the not yet made real creative. So the point is that in the daimonic is the creative. And so, but the point is, like Jung says, when an unconscious daimonic content is ready to be integrated, it always forces the subject into its own form. It always appears physically, which means it gets dreamed up into objective-seeming form. So when you contemplate what's happening as a dream, of course, it's going to manifest, the stuff that we're unconscious of is going to manifest in a dark, seemingly evil way, because that's the way dreaming works. But then it's a question of, just like in physics, in quantum physics, they talk about, is the nature of light a wave or a particle? Well, it depends how you view it. It depends how you observe it. It depends how you dream it up. But there's nothing objective. That's one of the main discoveries of quantum physics. Well, is this dark evil force, is malignant egophrenia, which is this non-local, sort of disease of the psyche, is it going to destroy our species, or is it going to wake us up? And of course the answer is, it depends how we dream it. It depends if we recognize what's being revealed.
Do you think that, many people in power become these kind of symbols for all people to actually view in this sense? Because at this point, I guess we live in a world where we actually have many people within the top positions of corporations and stuff like this that are very corrupt in that sense.
Absolutely, and the thing to understand is that the people in the position of power, their expressions of, the actual, like for example, with President Bush, he's a symptom, a manifestation of the collective psyche of America, and so it's actually, he's a reflection. I call him an embodied reflection of our own state of consciousness, and not just America, but really of the world. But the thing I want to point out about this, you see, even though it's horrific what is playing out through Bush and other of these so-called, leaders, whatever, from the dreaming point of view, it's actually a really good sign, because when, the fact that this evil, this darkness, this shadow is actually, becoming completely overtly obvious, like it's coming out from hiding in the corners, from hiding underground, from hiding in the shadows, and it's completely out for all who have eyes to see. That itself is an expression, like an example, when you have a deep dark shadow, that's an expression that there's a real strong source of light nearby, where there can be the shadow.
Yeah.
So the shadow itself is an expression of the intensity of the light. And like I continually point out in the book, something is being shown to us, and it's through the agency of our consciousness that we actually are able to, sort of integrate and have the recognition of what's being shown, so as to actually transform our situation. Now, a thing I just want to go back to, if I can, with the field, because I mentioned the field, component of malignant egophrenia, and that's really important to understand, because I'm pointing out, just like classical physics has a certain utility, but it's not really describing the ultimate nature of reality, because the ultimate nature of reality is inseparable. You can't quite, it's not like this world is made up of separate components that are distinct from each other, but it's a seamless whole. What I'm doing in my book is contemplating this psychospiritual disease of the soul, malignant egophrenia, that pervades the field, that's in all of us, that President Bush is embodying, from the point of view not of the separate self, but from the point of view of the holistic self, in which we're all interconnected. And the way to understand this, say if somebody, they don't recognize that Bush is mad, and that he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, or that he's, like in the book I say, he's embodying what it is to be criminally insane. If they don't recognize that and they support Bush, by them actually supporting Bush, they themselves become the instrument through which this non-local field disease replicates itself. And that's the way a collective psychosis works. So I'm pointing out that our species is in the midst of a psychic epidemic, that we're suffering from a collective psychosis, and it's so pervasive that hardly anybody's even talking about it, which is an expression of how our insanity has become so seemingly normalized.
Yeah. and okay, now you guys had an election over there, midterm election, I guess. So we got some Democrats in there, I guess. But before that, the 2004 election, it was, I guess, if the numbers are correct and all of that, but it was down to basically a 50-50 type deal. So, I mean, again, you guys as a nation, I guess, as a whole, are very, split down the middle, so to speak, on this issue, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm actually very skeptical. I mean, because there's been overwhelming evidence that the elections, even the 2004 election, were just totally rigged in favor, of the Republican. And so, when people say 50-50, I mean, I really question that, because I think the majority of Americans are really waking up and seeing the absolute insanity and criminality of the Bush administration. And I just recently wrote an article called "We Need to Impeach Bush for His Own Good," because part of malignant egophrenia is that it ultimately it's invariably self-destructive, and it's self-destructive for everybody within the domain of the person so afflicted, which is all of well.
Yeah.
So the idea that we need to remove him from office for his own good, as well as our own, is true.
Yeah.
So the point is, I just really feel, that I don't know, that the overwhelming majority of Americans are just more and more beginning to wake up. But the thing which is interesting, and I go into this in my book, there's a field of unconsciousness that gets conjured up around Bush because he's so, you see, the way malignant egophrenia works, you become so taken over by your unconscious and so possessed by it that you actually, in a sense, are identified with the archetype that underlies the illness. And from that point of view, you forfeited your humanity. And because of that, there's like some sort of charisma or magnetism that comes through you, sort of like you're a transducer of archetypal forces, which can have a very enchanting effect on people's unconscious. So because of that, there's a field that gets conjured up around Bush, and so people who are supporters of him, they actually, in a way, it's like they're codependently feeding in to his psychosis by supporting him, which then confirms to him that he really is, divinely inspired and all that, and that feeds into their, their desire, their lack, their like this need in them to have like maybe a father figure to protect them. But the point is that it's this reciprocal, codependent process between Bush and his supporters that actually constellates an impenetrable field of consciousness around them. And that's why I imagine so many people have experiences of trying to talk in a logical way to a Bush supporter and just, present them with the overwhelming evidence, and it just doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
It's because as if they're under a spell or entranced.
Very interesting. Do you think that that these types of leaders or these archetypes, basically, as you say, are also becoming, I don't know, if stronger, I guess, in some sense, in regards to that they are, let me say like this. I mean, if we compare Bush to previous presidents, I guess we could say, in some sense that it gets, more and more worse, it feels like, in some sense. So, I mean, do you think that this is a kind of a reflection also that, we have to deal with this issue now because, if we don't do that, we just get people up there in these kinds of positions that are going to continue to,
Sure,
be worse and worse?
I can just talk about myself. Like, I personally, I mean, I've been, here I began having the spiritual awakening in 1981, and and I've just been a spiritual practitioner for my whole life. I wasn't politically interested whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then when Bush became president, I just right away, I just found myself so disturbed, and there was something that was getting triggered in me that, that was just, I was repulsed by what he was reflecting back. And what I did with it, I just went inside and tried to inquire into what is that within me that's getting activated. And so, that's an example of like the fact that, the person that central casting, in this case, has sent to play the role of president, i.e. George W. Bush, is so completely just like, this caricature of something and so embodying to such an overtly, like, extreme degree, this pathology actually got me interested in politics and actually awakened the political consciousness in me. And so I think that's one of the deeper processes that's happening, because one of the things I point at, I have a chapter in the book called Spiritually Informed Political Activism. And I point out that, like, those two, like, spiritual practitioners and political activists have to, in a sense, inform and sort of, like, cross-pollinate each other in a way. Because if you're just a political activist, like, if you think about it, the typical political activist, they react against Bush with, like, hatred, and they see him as separate from themselves.
Yeah.